Hello, this is Ralph K. Ginorio, and welcome to part 2 of my video lesson on the terrorist atrocities of 9/11-01 and their historical background. This is a variation on lessons that I taught in my world history classes for the last dozen years, starting on September 11th, 2001 itself, where, to explain to my kids and for my own mental health, I spent the days after 9/11 and the hours after the attacks explaining why they happened. I happen to be wearing this tie on September the 11th, 2001. It's a tie my mother gave to me. It's a New York tie. I like New York ties, and I love, as many New Yorkers do, skyscrapers and particularly the Empire State Building. And as a child growing up, I, like many New Yorkers, had a disdain for the architect Yamazaki's twin monoliths. They were, compared to the beauty of the stone and glass of the Empire State Building, functional and cold, utilitarian, very, very modern. But you'll notice in the background, no, maybe you will, the Twin Towers. So on the day I wore this, and on the day that the class who I went through 9/11 with graduated, I wore this, and I wear it every year. I've worn it every year when I've taught the lesson, and I'm wearing it now. That day, the events of that day, is the subject of this video. And succeeding videos will be on the historical background behind it. That day, as I understand it, no doubt you can find people with better technical expertise and with superior first-hand knowledge, but the job of a history teacher is to tell a story, and my job is to tell the story as I understand it, warts and all. So, what happened? Well, on the morning, early morning of September the 11th, 2001, two men walked through the Portland Jetport Terminal. This is a place I've been many times. I used to take people walking there. It's a beautiful little airport. One of them was Mohammed Atta, who was the leader of who the Islamists call the Magnificent 19. That morning, from a variety of places, 19 men gathered into the airports in Boston and New York. They boarded 4 transcontinental flights aimed at cities on the West Coast, filled to the gills with aviation gas, with jet fuel. As the planes took off, the men took their seats like anything else. But a few minutes into the flight, the differences began to happen. They each had stowed box cutters, razor knives, and they deployed them. Now, in a movie, what they would do is threaten and brandish the weapons. But that's a movie. In reality, the attention getter is you grab the hair of the person in front of you and you slice. After having gotten the attention of the passengers, they moved them to the back of the plane, except for a few hostages that they brought up to the doors of the cockpit, threatening the pilots with the death of these hostages if the pilots didn't give control of the plane over to them. Now, so far, what had happened was bloody, but it wasn't beyond the pale of everyone's expectations. People understood hijacking. Hijackings had happened since the 1960s and 70s. Somebody hijacks a plane. Maybe they take it to Cuba. Maybe they take it to Uganda. They take it somewhere where they can use the hostages as bargaining chips in some game for money or political power. Everyone knew that, and so the training of the flight crews that morning was oh so simple. Cooperate to the extent you believe it is possible to save as many lives among your passengers as possible. So everyone knew what was going to happen. The pilots gave control of the cockpits to the terrorists took control of the planes, they seemed to know what they were doing, the pilots were moved to the back of the planes as well. That was all according to everyone's plan and expectations. The planes then dived below the radar. Two of the planes were targeted on the financial capital of the world. Two of them were targeted on the political capital of the free world, the United States. New York City, Washington, D.C. First anyone knew something was unusual was the sound of a screaming jetliner coming down at much lower than normal altitude. Now, as somebody who grew up in the Bronx directly under the flight path to LaGuardia Airport, hearing the sound of jet engines low is disturbing, but it's not that unusual. So New Yorkers may have looked up. Some with video cameras definitely did look up. And they looked up to see something unprecedented. One of the planes flying full speed about 3/4 to 4/5 of the way up one of the towers. This is a disaster. What could have gone wrong? Was it the flight controls? Did the pilot have a seizure? Well, we've got to get the people out of those buildings, so fire crews and emergency crews and police crews from all over the city converged to try to rescue the people in the Twin Towers. And then the second plane, down the Hudson River, gained altitude, and into the second building. Clearly this is not an accident. Clearly this is not happenstance. What's going on? Well, the attack on the Twin Towers was brilliant. Evil can be brilliant, and this is an example of the brilliance of evil, and explain why they did what they did. Yamazaki, the architect, designed the Twin Towers to optimize what an office building can do. They were intended to be the tallest buildings in the world, which, as everyone knew, should be in New York City. And so he built a tower or two towers like no other. The standard glass and steel office building of the International era had a structure of internal supports that held up one floor above the other. And these supports could be seen as columns throughout office space, and you have the center node of elevators and utilities, and around it, in most office buildings, you've got the columns that contain the steel struts that hold the walls up. But Yamazaki was going to create an internal space that was airy and beautiful. And it was. Instead of creating supports within the structure like a skeleton, he created an exoskeleton. These tall, vertical struts, heavy walls, were going to carry the weight of the floors. So each floor was suspended from the walls. People hadn't built like this since the Middle Ages. It's this internal structure. Buildings are supposed to be vertebrates in the modern era, held up by an internal skeleton. Not invertebrates, held up by an external carapace, but Yamazaki built the Twin Towers to have a strong, rigid external carapace, an exoskeleton, to hold these floors up. So that when you left the elevator, if you owned the entire floor, you had this unobstructed space beyond the central node that you could do anything you want with. Unobstructed by columns, unobstructed by struts, open space, flexible to do with as you will. Brilliant. These were strong buildings. Not only did they withstand a French daredevil who tightrope walked from one tower to the other in the 1970s, they withstood hurricanes, storms. They were designed to rigidly withstand whatever could reasonably be thrown at them. But the architect of the attack understood something. He understood what office buildings were used for. And so, when the first plane hit the tower, they didn't hit the tower at the very top. He didn't hit the tower too low. It would have been impossible because of other buildings. He actually hit the tower, I have the angle wrong. He hit the tower between 3/4 and 4/5 of the way up. A sweet spot. Now, when a modern jetliner flies in a dive at nearly top speed, it is the proverbial unstoppable force. Here you have a plane more massive than almost any missile, filled to the gills with one of the most flammable substances known to man. The walls of the Twin Towers, as I've already said, were rigid structures designed to support massive weight. They are the proverbial immovable object. Well, what happens when a proverbial unstoppable force meets a proverbial immovable object at almost the speed of sound? The normal laws of physics, as we understand them, practically broke down. The plane didn't slide through the tower. At the point where the plane kissed the tower, back here, it and a tower section proximate to where it hit ceased to exist. Instead, they disintegrated and carried their force through the building to come out the other side as almost atomized particulate matter. Flame, glass, steel, fuel, people rain down on the streets below. Hundreds were killed in the initial impact. But still, the buildings held. And except for the people in the direct impact zone, there was every reason to believe that the people below could be evacuated downward, and that the people above could be evacuated through the helipads on the roof, which were designed for that purpose. When the second plane hit, the same thing. It hits the tower, the far side, atomizes, and its force gets carried through the building, out the other side. And again, you've got a section of the building where hundreds have been killed, but for the most part, there's every reason to expect that the disaster's scope can be mitigated by the heroism and skill of New York's bravest and New York's finest. The buildings held. They absorbed the impact of the proverbial unstoppable force. But it was never the planes that were going to destroy the tower. The plan was for something inside the tower that would be there in massive quantities because the tower is an office building. The aviation gas, when it atomized, didn't stop combusting. It found paper. Massive amounts of paper. Paper filling those spaces, ready to ignite. The jet fuel was everywhere. The paper combusted. And suddenly you've got a massive firestorm in both buildings beginning to spread. As the helicopters approached in order to pull people out, the heat blooms coming off these buildings were so intense that they could not get anywhere near them. Almost tornadic force winds prevented a helicopter rescue. Without helicopters, everyone above these fires was dead. They didn't know it yet, but they were dead. Still, the police and fire moved into the buildings, high-ranking as well as low-ranking, to coordinate a rescue of the people out through the base of the towers and away. Now, 2 or 3 days after 9/11, I advised my students to stop watching television news because it had stopped being informative. By that point, we knew everything we were going to know in short approximation to the event. And what was beginning to happen was what I would call red pornography, not the pornography of sex and lust, but the pornography of blood and death. They had begun showing close-up pictures. They had begun playing the sounds of phone calls. The space that Yamazaki designed was light and airy, not just because of the lack of internal struts, but because of the way that he designed the outer walls. They were designed as a series of vertical struts, parallel to one another, that stretched from floor to ceiling. You've got these hyper-narrow windows. And from a distance, and I can tell you, I saw this when I was at the observation tower as a kid. From a distance, the human eye plays the trick of focusing on the light and ignoring the darkness. So it looked almost as if the ceiling was suspended by nothing, just in midair. In fact, these rigid external struts supported the weight of the building. Well, the fires began. And as at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire back almost 100 years ago, people would rather do almost anything than burn. So, even though these spaces were really too narrow for a human being to squeeze through, the people up here began breaking the windows, which wasn't an easy trick in the first place, and squeezing out so that they could jump rather than burn. The news media was playing last telephone calls of people as they were roasting before they were jumping. We don't need to hear that. We don't need to see up close what it's like when another person dies. There's something voyeuristic and sick and obscene about that. We're all going to experience death firsthand, and we all experience death secondhand throughout our lives as the people we love come to terms with their mortality. We don't need to get up close and smell the bad breath of the person as they're dying of horror. So the fire spread, and the people died, and then the attack, the promise of the attack was fulfilled. The hot, burning firestorm became sufficiently hot to liquefy the metal of the outer walls. And when that happened, ceiling pancaked down to floor. And when that began, a chain reaction of events began, causing the building to literally fall into its own cellar hole, as ceiling pancaked absolutely everything on the floor below it, bringing the towers straight down. One, the other. Had those towers been at full capacity, had it been noon or 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning rather than 9 a.m. or just before, instead of 3,000 casualties, we could very well have been looking at 8,000 or 12,000 casualties. The buildings were massive and they could house huge numbers of people. The glass and steel towers came down, and the Tower of Babel story was retold by Al-Qaeda. That hideous pride that we Americans had that we could scrape the sky was brought low by their bravery. Oh yes, I'm sure they're very happy with the martyrdom of the Magnificent 19. So the attack on New York was a success from their point of view. Now we go to Washington. The first plane was going to target the White House. But that morning, the President of the United States was not there. He was, according to the news, in Florida reading to school children as part of his literacy initiative. So the terrorists learned this, and they were flying towards Washington, and their target was empty of the person that they really wanted to kill. So the capital of the free world is visited with the bizarre sight of a jetliner circling at high speed until it finds a worthy target. And that worthy target is the Pentagon. Now, the Pentagon is the antithesis of the World Trade Center. It was built during World War II of stone and steel, not glass and steel. It is the largest office complex in the world. It has a series of concentric rings. And there's a rumor that there is a nuclear power plant below it that perhaps the Al-Qaeda terrorists knew. So they targeted their plane on one of the wings, the Navy wing, of the Pentagon, and hit it, killing over 100 servicemen and civilians. That damage was relatively rapidly repaired. The Pentagon survived. Had they targeted a nuclear power plant, it would have been a very different story. So the third plane was a partial success from the terrorist point of view. The fourth plane, one thing about Bush. There are all sorts of left-wingers, from Michael Moore on down, that criticize him for continuing to read when he first got the news. You can see the look on his face while he's reading to children, and aide comes in and whispers to him, "We're under attack." Yes, he kept reading, because he was a man. Because you don't panic and scare school children. You don't play Chicken Little shouting, "The sky is falling." He kept calm. He finished the story, he got up calmly, he wished the kids a good day, and he left. And that is what I would hope to do if I were in a similar situation. Shouting "the sky is falling" would help no one, and would have traumatized those kids. Shame on those people who criticize having never borne real responsibility in their lives. The fourth plane was over Pennsylvania. It was behind schedule. People in the back of the plane had communication devices, and they were beginning to get the news. This is not a normal hijacking. They're not going to Havana, Cuba. They're going to die. And they're going to die being used as missiles against thousands of people on the ground. So a guy named Todd Beamer was one of several passengers who decided, if we're going to die, we might as well die on our feet, not on our knees. He called his wife, wished her goodbye. The last words anyone heard out of his mouth over the phone was, "Let's roll," and they took the plane. Unfortunately, we're not successful in stopping it from crashing into a field, an empty field in western Pennsylvania. For the next 2 weeks, nothing flew over the United States except fighter planes. At the same time, anthrax was mailed through the mail. At the same time, John Allen Muhammad and a boy began sniping in the Washington, D.C. area, killing, I think, about 50 people. The country was under attack in a way it had never been before. Our world had changed. The dream of peace that we had dreamed was over. People were at war with us. Mom was wrong. It doesn't take two to fight. It takes one to fight. When you're faced with a threat that will not go away, a threat that will take what you have, whether that is your freedom, your wealth, or your life, you don't have the choice of making peace. You can survive